Greetings, students. As always, I hope you're doing well. We are moving on with our exploration of Socrates, right? This is the Socrates portrayed by Plato in his extensive set of dialogues. But as I've said, we are focused on the Socratic dialogues. These are the dialogues we think were written early on in Plato's career. And we think these dialogues really tell us important things about what Socrates believed and how Socrates approached philosophical problems, right? So we feel like we're getting to know Socrates through the Apology, that's what we read first, and then the Crito, and now the Euthyphro, right? And when we talk a little bit about the Phaedo, we don't think, I certainly don't think that we're getting to know a lot about Socrates there. It seems that we're getting to know some of Plato's doctrines when we look at the part of the Phaedo that we're interested in, which has to do with equality. Okay, so what do we want to say right off the bat here? This is a typical Socratic dialogue. It's focused on a specific virtue. It ends in aporia, meaning neither Socrates nor Euthyphro really has a good or definite grasp on what this virtue is. At the end of the dialogue, the virtue in question is piety. Okay. Now, if I tried to give a good definition of that right now, or certainly one that would satisfy Socrates, we'd get really into the weeds right away. So I won't try to do that, since you might not be used to talking about piety. I will simply say that piety seems to have something to do with correctly relating to the gods, right? It's a virtue that has something to do with our relationship to the gods, and I say gods plural because the Greeks are polytheists, right? The ancient Greeks are, anyway. So a lot of names actually are thrown out in this text. There are names of various gods that come up, right? We're not interested in them in a specific way, but there is a polytheistic context here that we should be aware of. Okay, and what does it mean to relate to the gods in the right way? Well, some of the things that come up are prayer and sacrifice, specifically. I would say worship, having the right beliefs somewhat indirectly comes up. It's not terribly important to the ancient Greeks to have exactly the right beliefs to be an orthodox believer in the way that it would, later loom large over Christianity. But it's there in the text, right? There's a question about whether Socrates has the right beliefs. Euthyphro is careful to have the right beliefs based on the right texts. So, okay, so those are a few of the things that are involved with piety. Now, there's a broader meaning of piety, and there's a natural slide into this broader meaning, and it's getting thrown around in the text as well, right? The gods presumably want us to be morally upright or morally good persons. So to be pious is to be good in general, and so that would involve having all the virtues, right? So piety is a specific virtue, and it has to do with relating to the gods in the right way, but then at the same time, sometimes Euthyphro and Socrates seem to be talking about just being a morally good person, right? And again, that's a natural slide from a more narrow meaning into a broader one, and we don't need to worry about that too much, but we should be aware of it. finally, I've cited the dialogue right here at the beginning again. We are looking at the translation originally composed by Grube and then revised by Cooper, and this is available in the book called Five Dialogues, published by Hackett. I want to give you some historical context that will help you understand the dialogue better, right? So that's what this slide is about. It's important to say that Euthyphro and Socrates meet at the King Archon's court. So what does that mean? We have to talk about that a little bit. So there are 9 magistrates that run the city, basically. Again, we've talked about how, the assembly can't run things on a day-to-day basis. So there is a council with rotating members that's fairly large, right? And then there are these 9 magistrates that act in official capacities. They do various things in service to the city. 6 of them are judges, okay, and then the King Archon is one of the judges and one of the 9 magistrates. King Archon is the name of a role, right? It's not an individual's name. So somebody serves as King Archon. And then this court, the court of the King Archon, handles offenses against the Olympian gods, right? Socrates is being indicted. He is appearing for his indictment, not yet for his trial. And that means that he's come to hear the charges read to him. He clearly has heard something about the charges. He has some idea what they're about. But he has the right, as a citizen, to come and hear the charges against him publicly stated, right? So he knows what he has to deal with when he shows up for his trial later, okay? So one of the charges is impiety, right? Socrates believes in strange new gods, not in the city's gods. That's why he's here. And then as for why Euthyphro is here, some scholars say that the King Archon dealt with homicides and not just offenses against the Olympian gods. But I would also say Euthyphro is treating what his father has done. His father has killed someone out of negligence. We'll talk about that more later. But Euthyphro is treating that killing as a religious matter. He's saying that it's polluted his household and now he needs to cleanse the household, right? And so that certainly could explain why Euthyphro is here at the King Archon's court, okay? So now we have some understanding of how the two have this encounter, right? And we don't know whether the encounter really happened, right? We wouldn't be able to independently verify that, but this does seem to be put forward as the kind of conversation that Socrates tended to have with people, right? When you hear in the Apology about these conversations, you imagine something like what happens in the Euthyphro. So this is compatible with what we've already learned about Socrates in the Apology, right? And in the Crito to some lesser extent. Okay, so that's it for this slide. Let's talk about these characters a bit, right? Now we're familiar with Socrates, but let's say in a general way what we see from Socrates here. We already have some background on him. We know what kinds of things he tends to do and say. So this can be brief, but basically we see a lot of flattery and we see a lot of irony and we see some rhetorical posturing, and all of it's meant to keep Euthyphro engaged in the discussion, right? So really what we see behind the scenes, I suppose you could say, is curiosity. Socrates wants to know. I don't think he has high hopes that Euthyphro can tell him something important. I do think, however, that Socrates is sincere. He really wants to know about piety. Euthyphro really does have a reputation for knowledge of piety, so Socrates is going to approach this as if Euthyphro really knows, and Socrates is going to get it out of him, right? So, as far as the irony and the posturing go, you know, Socrates keeps calling Euthyphro his friend or even his dear friend. He continually says he's wise, right? I'm so impressed by what you're doing, prosecuting your own father, right? That's amazing. He puts a positive spin on it. Wow, you have such amazing knowledge of piety to be doing something like this. So Socrates can't 100% sincerely mean that, right? He is impressed, not necessarily in a positive way, by what Euthyphro is doing. But it's true that if someone departs quite a bit from conventional morality, we expect them to be able to explain themselves, right? To be able to give a good account of what they're doing and why. So that's part of the posturing. Socrates keeps acting as if Euthyphro can tell him something important, right? And you might keep thinking, why? Why is Socrates acting this way? Well, it's Euthyphro's own behavior that merits this kind of intense scrutiny, is what it is. Socrates is trying to be friendly, but it's a kind of scrutiny, right? Again, driven by Socrates' insatiable curiosity, right? Socrates really does desire to know. Here's a guy acting really confidently about engaging in some unusual behavior, and he confidently says that it's morally correct. So Socrates says, tell me what you know. Okay, as for Euthyphro himself, he is supposed to be an expert. We don't know much about his reputation beyond that. We mostly know what we get from the text, right? People look to Euthyphro as a guide, as someone who knows the religious texts really well, who can say what the texts indicate and interpret them in the right way, right? And Euthyphro is overconfident and wants to retain that title of expert, right? And so he is prone to giving into flattery, right? You can see that in the text. You can see the way Socrates uses flattery to keep Euthyphro going. You can see the way Euthyphro accepts the flattery largely at face value. He's very confident in himself, so he's not taking it as ironic or sarcastic as far as we can tell. He's just giving in to the flattery. All right, I want to dig into this case. We want to understand what exactly Euthyphro's father did and what Euthyphro wants to put him on trial for. That will help us understand how Euthyphro conceives his own action. Right, so he's prosecuting his father. What did his father do that was so bad that Euthyphro needs to prosecute him? Let's figure this out. The victim of the father's action is called a dependent a couple of times, so I'll try to stick to that word. But let me explain what that means a little bit. I've read another translation that uses the word day laborer. So keep that translation in mind. This person was someone attached to the household who made his living from the household, right? He didn't have an independent income. He seems to have been involved in farming, so we can infer that he farmed the family estate, Euthyphro's family's estate, right? And that's how he got by. That's how he made a living. So that's what the word dependent means here. Okay. And he liked to drink. Well, we don't know how much he liked to drink, but we know that he killed this other person attached to the household in a drunken rage, as it's put. And this is normal in the ancient Greek world, by the way. A household, an independent household, would typically have some money and they would have hangers on. They would have people attached to the household who were making their living in various ways from the household. Okay, so yeah, they might have several servants, they might have several dependents, whatever we want to call them. This is nothing unusual. So this dependent, as we've called him, kills the servant in a drunken anger. And then Papa Euthyphro, let's call him, he doesn't like this. He doesn't like seeing people killed, for one thing, and he probably doesn't like having a servant killed. Now he's out a servant, right? So he has the dependent bound and put in a ditch. And then he sends someone to downtown Athens. They wouldn't have called it downtown exactly, but he sends someone to central Athens to try to find out what should be done. So he is seeking religious guidance, right? He's sending someone to a priest, or an exegete would be another translation, someone who can consult the scriptures and say what is to be done. Unfortunately for everyone involved, this dependent in a ditch dies while someone is trying to find out what should we do with him. Okay, so this troubles Euthyphro's family, as you've read. Why are you prosecuting your father on behalf of a murderer who's just a servant? Economic status and social station comes into it. Why prosecute your father on behalf of someone like that? Okay. Now Euthyphro's standpoint is, what my father did, he shouldn't have done. We could agree with that part, right? So my dad was negligent, so fine. The family is saying he's not a murderer. We could concede that. I don't know what exactly Euthyphro is willing to concede here, but we could say, all right, well, he's not a murderer, but he killed this guy through negligence, right? So this is manslaughter. Euthyphro says his father has brought pollution into the household. Okay, the Greek word here is miasma. So when you do something bad that displeases the gods, it's like a stench. The Greeks always conceived of this as a stench, as a smell that won't go away. So there's this religious stench in the house, right? And so Euthyphro needs to do something about it. He believes that by prosecuting his father for the crime, he can cleanse the household. He can get rid of the miasma, right? So the last thing I want to make clear here with respect to this slide is, well, Euthyphro is claiming strong knowledge, robust knowledge of piety, right? Because he's saying it was impious of his father to kill this dependent through negligence. And then it's pious of him to rectify the situation by prosecuting his father, right? And I want to point that out because that helps us make sense of what Socrates is doing. Why is Socrates treating this guy like he knows something? Well, look at how he's acting. Look at how confident he is. His actions speak to knowledge of piety and impiety. And so Socrates is taking this somewhat at face value, right? And just saying, well, if you're going to act like that, you must know something. Not that Socrates believes that at a deep level, but he's just taking Euthyphro seriously, right? In a way, he's just saying, well, this is how you're acting, so this is how things must be. This is the kind of knowledge you must have. So that's respectful, even if Socrates comes across as ironic or even sarcastic. This slide is looking a little redundant now because I elaborated so much on an earlier slide. But there are a couple things I want to get out of here, right? So first of all, I've got a quote here. I mentioned that Socrates said something like this, but let's go ahead and read the quote. So Socrates says to Euthyphro, "Certainly, Euthyphro, most men would not know how they could do this and be right. It is not the part of anyone to do this, but of one who is far advanced in wisdom." So I hope you're seeing the irony better now. So I think that's worth quoting. There are layers to this, right? Um, it certainly sounds as if Socrates is saying that Euthyphro is wise. So if Euthyphro already thinks he's wise and sees himself as an expert, then what Euthyphro hears from Socrates is, "You're very wise." The statement is more complicated than that, though, right? Socrates isn't saying you're wise. It's not that simple. He's saying someone who would do something like this, we would expect to be wise. He's saying it's not the part of anyone to do this, but of one who is far advanced in wisdom. He doesn't even directly say you're acting as if you're wise or you're looking like you're wise. He's saying that if somebody does a thing like this, we would expect them to have advanced moral wisdom. So it's almost a put down, like right at the beginning of the text before we even really get going. But it sounds like a compliment, and Euthyphro takes it as a compliment. I doubt that Socrates straightforwardly meant it as a compliment, right? And I didn't say this specifically, so it's worth stating now that we've got it on the screen. It's not just that Socrates says, I want to learn from your wisdom, I want to be your student, Euthyphro. He is also suggesting that he can take this knowledge of piety to court with him, and he can use it to cow Meletus, right? So he could sort of put Meletus in his place by saying, oh, Euthyphro is my tutor now. So on the one hand, I've got this great knowledge of piety, perhaps, if I've been able to receive Euthyphro's wisdom very well. I've got this great knowledge of piety, so I'm going to use it against you, Meletus. And then if Meletus doesn't listen to Socrates, he can bring his teacher Euthyphro into court, right? So Socrates says all of that. I hope you're understanding by now that it's doubtful that Socrates means it, right? He's got to get Euthyphro engaged in the conversation. He's got to try to ferret out this wisdom. So, I can't help but wonder, is he lying then? Is he just straightforwardly lying? Um, that's complicated. I think he's saying things that are true on the surface, but if another wise person is listening, they can hear certain overtones, right? And certainly Plato is writing that way. There's a surface meaning, and then there's a deeper meaning for those who are in the know, so to speak, right? So it's on the surface of it, what Socrates is saying is true. If Euthyphro really does have this wisdom, Socrates really can make use of it in his trial, right? He can use it against Meletus. It's just that we know, we've already been talking about Socrates and watching Socrates. It's just that we know that Socrates has been disappointed over the course of decades now, right? We have that knowledge. I don't know how much Euthyphro knows about Socrates' mission. I don't know what their past conversations have been. But we know that Socrates has continually interrogated people and not gotten what he wanted. So we hear the irony. But what he's saying has a truth that is serviceable on the face of it. I don't know. Maybe you could construe it as a lie. So maybe Socrates was willing to engage in little lies to get what he wanted. But in any case, that's where we are. It's important to understand that Socrates has some pretty substantial criteria, or in other words, requirements for what will count as a good definition of piety. And these requirements come up in other dialogues, or similar requirements come up in other dialogues, right? So these are criteria for a good definition of anything. Or we could even generalize from that and say, well, these are criteria for knowledge of something. But the focus does seem to be on giving an account or giving a definition, right? So the first criterion, right, that's the singular. Criteria is plural, criterion is singular. The first criterion comes up in the initial question that Socrates asks to get the ball rolling. Socrates doesn't just ask, what is piety? It's not that simple. Here's what he actually asks. This is at 5c to 5d. He says to Euthyphro, so tell me now by Zeus what you just now maintained you clearly knew. What kind of thing do you say that godliness and ungodliness are, both as regards murder and other things? Or is the pious not the same and alike in every action, and the impious the opposite of all that is pious and like itself? And everything that is to be impious presents us with one form or appearance insofar as it is impious? Question mark. So there's a lot being stated here, even though this is technically a question, right? So Socrates is saying, he's asking what is piety, but he's also saying, here's the kind of answer I want you to give. And there's one main requirement here, and the requirement is that Euthyphro give a general or universal answer. Socrates uses different phrasing to suggest that pious is the same in different pious actions. There's some reason we use the word pious for these different pious actions, so there must be something the actions have in common. So what we want to do is say what they have in common, or what is the same across the different pious actions, right? So we could call it a universality requirement or a generality requirement, something like that. So there's this idea in the question itself that there is a form of piety. This is not yet a Platonic form, which we'll talk about in connection with the Phaedo. Form means, well, certainly could mean just appearance here. So somehow the actions appear the same. And what Socrates wants Euthyphro to tell him is, well, what is the nature of that appearance? How is it that they appear the same? What are we seeing exactly, we have some kind of intuitive knowledge, but let's articulate it. We're grouping these actions together for a reason and calling them by the same name. Let's say what the reason is. Let's make it explicit and clear. Okay, so we finally have a question on the table. What is piety? There's also this pretty robust requirement that's been put out there, but let's focus on the question and how Euthyphro tries to answer it. Okay, so this is the first account of piety, and in this first account, Euthyphro tries to construe piety as dealing with wrongdoers, trying to correct wrongdoers, or even really more specifically prosecuting wrongdoers. If you think that's a little too narrow or too on the nose, you are correct. Okay, so let's quote him here. Socrates has just asked the question, so we're at 5D, and this goes into 5E. Euthyphro says, I say that the pious is to do what I am doing now to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else, whether the wrongdoer is your father or your mother or anyone else. Not to prosecute is impious. Okay, so we had one requirement, right? We had one requirement, and that was a requirement for generality or universality. And Euthyphro's answer doesn't cut it. It violates that stipulation that Euthyphro gives an answer that applies to all possible instances of piety. This is way too narrow. As the slide here notes, it's also self-serving. It's not just that Euthyphro is picking examples instead of picking a general definition or stating a general definition. He's picking what he is doing as the prime example of piety, which is not very plausible, right? Piety is rightly relating to the gods, roughly speaking. It's something like that. Prosecuting someone who's already done something wrong is a pretty indirect way of rightly relating to the gods. I'm not saying that what Euthyphro is doing is definitely not pious. I am saying it's a couple steps removed from what we would probably think of as prime examples or paradigmatic examples of pious behavior. Since Euthyphro has not given a good answer, and he violated the only requirement there was, Socrates reminds him of what the question is, and I've put remind in quotes because on the one hand, Socrates does remind Euthyphro of something. He reminds him of the fact that he was supposed to say what different pious actions have in common, right? And that was definitely stated initially. However, I do think when Socrates reminds Euthyphro of what he already said, he states some further criteria, further requirements, right? So he reminds Euthyphro, hey, I want to know about all pious actions, not just one. He says, I wanted you to tell me that form itself that makes all pious actions pious. He says they are pious through a single form or appearance. Or you could say, there are different ways to translate this text, of course. You could say, well, they are pious in virtue of a single form, because of a single form. There's some kind of metaphysical criterion here. I know that's a big word, metaphysical, but that is what's going on. There's something that the pious actions have in common that causes them to be pious. They're sharing something, right, that actually makes them pious, that constitutes them as pious. So I see it as fair to say, well, this is a metaphysical criterion. We want to know what makes pious actions pious. A little bit of metaphysics then. That's what we want. But then there's also an epistemological criterion. We want the form that we can use as a model to apply to any action, and then we should be able to say by applying the model that it is pious or it isn't pious, right? We should be able to have a standard that we can apply, and that's epistemological. That means there are epistemological criteria that have been stated that we actually use in a reasoning process, right? And so that's how we gain knowledge about actions. We know this one's pious, we know this one's impious because we have a good model. Another way to think about this is as an algorithm, not that, Plato and Euthyphro would have used that term, but we, in our situation, we can think of it as an algorithm. So we're looking for some kind of linear decision process that is well defined and definite, right? And if you give it the right input, it'll give you the right output. So you input an action that is somehow relevant to piety or impiety, and then you get definite output. It is pious. It isn't pious, right? It's impious, as a matter of fact. That does raise the issue, to my mind, that we actually want an algorithm that sometimes says this isn't good input, right? There are always parameters on the kind of input you should give a certain algorithm. So I would think, if Socrates and Euthyphro were around and I said to Socrates, well, should the algorithm say, when we're giving it bad data, I think Socrates would agree. Yeah, that's a good thing to stipulate. That's a good further stipulation. So I would stick by that, but that's not in the text. What the text says is we want a good model so that when we apply it to an action, we know definitely it's pious or it's impious. Now that Socrates has stated all his criteria, there are 3 of them, he's stated them all now. Euthyphro tries again, he gives his second account of piety, and now he construes piety as what the gods love. So at 7a, he says, what is dear to the gods is pious, what is not is impious. Socrates changes this a little bit without really noting it. Euthyphro doesn't complain, he just goes along with it. What Socrates repeats back to Euthyphro is what is dear to the gods or what they love is pious, what they hate is impious. This is actually related to my earlier caveat about having the right kind of input. There are lots of things that the gods don't really care about or consider right, and those things wouldn't be pious, but then they wouldn't be impious either if the gods don't really consider them or care about them, right? So what we want to say is if the gods love it, it's pious, and if they hate it, it's impious, and Socrates does make that change. Okay, so this is good. This is a good account in the sense that it's general. There is some attempt here to say what pious actions have in common, and in fact, it's plausible that all pious actions are loved by the gods, right? That is a plausible view on the face of it. So we've got a general account with some initial plausibility. Does it work? Well, no, it doesn't work because of some other beliefs that Euthyphro has. Socrates' beliefs are not the problem. They're not really at issue here. Euthyphro takes the texts by Homer and Hesiod very seriously. He takes them somewhat at face value, right? He's some kind of polytheistic fundamentalist here. Um, Euthyphro thinks that the gods fight with each other sometimes. They disagree, and their disagreements get out of hand, and they end up fighting with each other. Okay, and Socrates tries to connect that to human fighting. What do humans fight about? Um, and when do they have disagreements that they can't easily resolve? Well, that happens with respect to value questions, right? So if the question can be answered objectively, then humans tend to end their disagreement after a while, right? If they're arguing about how tall a building is, they could eventually agree to measure the building, right? Or if they're arguing about where the sun is in the sky, there are things you can do to, you could look at a sundial and figure out, okay, well, it's this many degrees above the horizon or something like this. I'm trying to stick to Greek examples. So this is what the Greeks would consider science and measurement and objectivity, and of course, if you make a big calculation, a big mathematical calculation, you can be really careful with the calculation, and you can fix mistakes, and so you can eventually come to an agreement if the issue is mathematical. So any kind of disagreement that involves math, measurement, science, we should be able to resolve a disagreement like that. We should be able to be more careful in our process. We should be able to make new observations. We should be able to settle the matter. So then the point is, well, what is it we keep disagreeing about? And that's value questions, right? If I think Lady Gaga is the greatest pop artist of the 21st century, and you hate her and think she's terrible, and her music is just trite and uninteresting. Well, we don't have an objective standard that everybody agrees on or could agree on that we can appeal to. Right, so we're probably just going to experience resentment and rancor and things like that, right? If I love something and you hate it, or you love it and I hate it, then we're just going to get upset with each other if we keep talking about it, right? Okay, so that is very important here, because the definition on the table is the pious is what the gods love, what they hate is impious. So piety is being defined based on feelings such as love and hate, all right? And I've raised the issue of the beautiful. In a sense, I didn't use that word. I'm basically saying Lady Gaga's music is beautiful, and this hypothetical person that I'm arguing with is saying it's ugly, right? Now I love what's beautiful, and this person hates what's ugly, and that's generally what we do. Um, or I might think something is just, and that makes me love it, and then someone else thinks it's unjust, and therefore they hate it, right? And specifically, Kronos and Zeus are mentioned in the text, right? Zeus tried to punish Kronos for the way that he was treated and his siblings were treated. So Zeus probably thought the punishment was fitting or just, otherwise he wouldn't have done it. Kronos, didn't have any qualms about doing bad things to his kids, so I'm sure he thought the punishment was unjust and therefore he hated it, right? So Zeus is seeing something as just and loving it. Kronos is seeing the same thing as unjust and hating it. So is it pious or is it impious? Well, it's indeterminate. Uh-oh, that doesn't meet the algorithmic requirement or the epistemological requirement. We were supposed to be able to use the account as a model and apply it to any action and then say of that action, oh, now we know it's pious. Oh, now we know it's impious. Here's an action, Zeus trying to punish Kronos, that gives an indeterminate reading, right? Both pious and impious, depending on which god you consult. Okay, so the second account fails because the gods disagree among themselves, right? And so then some actions turn out to be both pious and impious as a result. The fact, or from Euthyphro's point of view anyway, the fact that the gods disagree, that some of them love the very same actions that others hate, and vice versa, this forces Euthyphro and Socrates to adopt a third account. Piety is what all the gods love, and what they all hate is impious. This account is actually suggested by Socrates, but Euthyphro signs on and says, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's make that the account at this point. Okay, and it is stated at 9d. It's important to understand that there's a stipulation here that renders the criticism of the second account moot. Students often want to say, maybe I shouldn't even say it, but I do want to warn you. Students often want to say that what is wrong with the third account is that the gods disagree with each other. Well, that doesn't work textually. Textually, what's happening is that was the criticism of the second account. So now Socrates is willing to assume that the gods really do hate what Euthyphro's father did, and so it's implied, it's not really stated explicitly, it's implied that the gods love what Euthyphro is doing in prosecuting his father, right? But it is explicit that Socrates is agreeing, he's assuming that the gods really do hate the way that Euthyphro's dad negligently killed that pendant, right? And so it's assumed, for the sake of the discussion, that the gods agree on something, right? So this is not vacuous when we talk about what all the gods love. So this is not an empty account, at least from the perspective of the text. We are stipulating that the gods do in fact agree on something. They don't disagree about everything. They agree that Euthyphro's dad should not have done that, and therefore Euthyphro should in fact prosecute him. Now, once the third account has been stated and Euthyphro has agreed to it, as I said, Socrates actually stated it, and then Euthyphro signed on. This leads to what we call the Euthyphro dilemma. There's this important question that Socrates asks. Maybe he was planning on asking this all along when the opportunity arose, right? So this is a well-known question, so well known that it has a name, right? Again, it's the Euthyphro dilemma. So what is the question? Well, it's stated at 10a. Socrates says to Euthyphro, is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? I want to tell you up front that Euthyphro's answer eventually, he doesn't quite get the question at first, but eventually Euthyphro's answer is they love it because it's pious. Okay, and we'll harp on that later, but I do want to make it clear that that is Euthyphro's final definitive answer to the question. Okay, but let's try to understand the question. This is a chicken and egg question, if that helps, right? Does one of these really come first, you might wonder? Well, we're trying to give an account of the deep nature of piety, so we think so. We think something is an ultimate cause here. We don't think we're just going in circles and there's no resolution, but I leave it to the viewer to think about, well, can there even be the kind of answer that's being sought here? Euthyphro and Socrates agree that question could conceivably be answered, right? So something comes first then. I mean, if the question is answerable, then something comes first, the chicken or the egg, or in this case, the love of the gods or piety. One of them comes first. Which is it, right? Okay. So first horn of the dilemma. If something, that's just how we talk about dilemmas, right? It always has two horns. I don't know why we use the word horn, but there it is. First horn of the dilemma. If something is pious just because the gods love it, then it seems piety is arbitrary. It depends on mere preference. It depends on whim. It depends on the caprice, the gods, right? That becomes clarified by thinking about the second horn of the dilemma. Well, if the gods love something because it's pious, that means the piety is already there and their love is being drawn toward it, but that makes piety independent of the god's love. The reason that's a second horn is just that, well, we would have thought the gods had some say, right? This is piety after all. It's correctly relating to the gods. We would have thought they had some say in what counts as piety and impiety. But we're having trouble with these options, right? First horn, it's pious just because they love it. That's not robust enough. It makes it seem as if piety is not important. Second horn, now piety seems independent. I don't necessarily think it's a horn of the dilemma. I think that might just be the way we have to go. But it's a problem for certain theological views, that God created morality or created the virtue of piety from nothing. If God's supposed to have the power to do that, this seems to put a limitation on God that we didn't think was there. As I noted, Euthyphro does not really understand what Socrates is asking him at first, right? So I want to get into so-called passive qualities, or we could call them extrinsic qualities, so that we can, with Euthyphro, understand what Socrates is getting at. There are more important philosophical issues here, but let's talk this over. It plays an important role in the text, and then we'll get to those, what I take to be more important philosophical implications. Okay, so Socrates has asked, well, is it pious because they love it, or do they love it because it's pious? He's trying to clarify this. So he talks about being seen and being carried and being loved. These are qualities that things have, technically, right? I'm being seen right now, or an image of me is being seen, presumably, right? I'm putting this into a video, putting it on YouTube. Okay, so I have the quality of being seen, or if you like, if you want to be more precise, my image has the quality of being seen. What does that involve? Am I a seen thing because I'm being seen, or am I being seen because I'm a seen thing? The question is confusing to Euthyphro, but there's a definite answer to that one. The correct answer is I'm a seen thing because I'm being seen. In other words, the activity of seeing has metaphysical primacy, right? That activity of seeing causes me to have the quality of being seen. So someone else has to see me, and then I have the quality of being seen. It's the same with being carried. There's my coffee mug. It was just being carried. It just had that property of being carried. Well, is it a carried thing because it's being carried, or is it being carried because it's a carried thing? Again, there's a correct answer there. It's a carried thing because it's being carried. The activity of carrying has metaphysical primacy. It's bringing that property of being carried into being, okay? And then finally, the same applies to being loved. If something is being loved, if it has the property of being loved, the love has primacy. The activity of loving is causing the property of being loved to come into being, right? It's not that the property of being loved is there and then it creates the activity of loving. That can't be right. We understand in this case, being loved is a passive quality or an extrinsic quality. It's being imposed on something by the love of someone, right? So that tells you something about this third account. Piety is what all the gods love. Okay, now I already said, Euthyphro eventually answers the question by saying they love it because it's pious. Okay. On the other hand, what about the God loved, we could call it? Is the God loved because it's being loved, or is it being loved because it's the God loved? Well, there seems to be a right answer there as well. It's the God loved because it's being loved. So again, the activity of loving has primacy, right? And so what's happening here is that a contradiction is emerging in Euthyphro's views, right? On the one hand, he wants to say that piety and God loved, or the pious and the God loved, are the same thing, right? Since the third account says, the pious is what all the gods love, that seems to be the same as saying the pious and the all God loved, if you like, pious and the all God loved are identical, right? But the thing is, Euthyphro insists that pious is loved by the gods because it is pious, so that the piety seems to have an independence to it. It's independent of what the gods are doing. But what is God loved cannot be independent of what the gods are doing. If something is God loved, it's because the gods are loving it. again, that activity of loving has primacy. So the God loved is dependent rather than independent. The God loved is dependent on what the gods are doing. So we have piety as an independent property or a substantial or intrinsic property of its own, according to Euthyphro. And then we have being loved by the gods. We could hyphenate all that, make it one property, being loved by the gods, or being loved by all the gods, hyphenate that. We could think of that as a property. There's no reason we couldn't do that. But the kind of property it is a dependent property or a passive property. So the pious is not equal to being loved by all the gods. These are not equivalent predicates or equivalent properties. Okay, so this slide brings out the contradiction in Euthyphro's thinking and his statements in a different way. We were just talking about intrinsic versus extrinsic qualities. That's a bit abstract, so let's come at it from a different angle. Socrates told Euthyphro, tell me what makes pious actions pious. And Euthyphro agreed to do that. So let's think about that in connection with the third account. So the third account is pious is what all the gods love. Well, if we assume that Euthyphro is trying to satisfy the second criterion, which it seems we should because he agreed to the second criterion and didn't complain about it or criticize it, then we get the view that the love of all the gods makes pious actions pious, right? So that's a more straightforward way, I think, to get at the contradiction. Euthyphro's definition must say that the love of the gods is making the pious pious because of that second criterion that Euthyphro and Socrates have agreed to. However, again, Euthyphro is committed to the view that the gods love the pious because it's pious, which means the piety is independent of their activity of loving. So that's a contradiction, right? If we say on the one hand, oh, the pious is what all the gods love, meaning their love is making the pious pious, and then we say on the other hand, well, they love it because it's pious, right? We're saying piety is dependent on the love of the gods, and then we're turning around and saying piety is independent of the love of the gods. It doesn't matter what they're doing. Well, you can't say both, right? It's dependent or it's independent. So which is it? I mean, ultimately, Euthyphro insists that it's independent. So then the third account has to be given up, right? Why does Euthyphro insist that piety is independent? Well, that's what the next slide is about. Basically, I want to kill two birds with one stone here. I want us to understand why Euthyphro insists that the pious is loved by the gods because it is pious. It is not pious because they love it. He insists on that when Socrates really puts the question to him emphatically, right? I also want to just talk about something more relatable because I imagine that piety is not a common topic of conversation for you, right? So let's talk about divine command theory, and this will help us with both issues. It'll help us understand why Euthyphro insists on what he does, and it will help us relate to this whole issue a little better. Okay, so divine command theory is a view of ethics, it's a view of right and wrong that some people still defend, but not very many philosophers defend it, I would say. There are some, but the view has some problems that are relevant here, right? Okay, so divine command theory states, this is how we define it, an action is morally right if, and only if, it is commanded by God. An action is morally wrong if, and only if, it is forbidden by God. Another way to put that is that God's command is a necessary and sufficient condition for an action's being right. And God's prohibition is a necessary and sufficient condition for an action's being wrong. Right? Because if we say it's right only if commanded by God, we're making the command necessary. If we're saying an action is right if commanded by God, and we don't use the word only, we're saying God's command is a sufficient condition, right? So when you say if and only if, you're saying it's necessary, you can't remove the condition, and it's also sufficient, it's enough by itself. So then that kind of makes things equivalent, right? If this is necessary and sufficient for that, they always go together. There's no gap between them. This condition matters. It gets us what we want, and it's the only condition that matters. Nothing, no other condition does, right? So we've sort of closed the gap between them, so they're pretty much equivalent. To say that something is right is to say that it's commanded by God. To say that something is wrong is to say that it's forbidden by God. Right? So that usually, if someone says I'm a proponent of divine command theory, that's what they have in mind, is that God's command is it. That's what really matters. That's what's crucial to morality. Okay. So you can already guess, probably, students usually have strong intuitions about this when I'm teaching in-person classes. Right, so you could probably guess what the problem here is, but let's give an explicit argument against divine command theory here. Number one, if DCT, divine command theory, if DCT were the correct theory of morality, then the commands of God that create morality would have to be completely arbitrary. They couldn't be based on morality, right? The commands are bringing morality into being, so the commands can't be based on a prior morality. So it seems that if DCT were the correct theory of morality, then the commands of God that create morality would have to be arbitrary. Number two, but God is supposed to be a morally perfect being. By convention, that's just part of what we seem to mean when we say God. Again, we're making this more relatable. So this is not in a polytheistic context. This is in a monotheistic context. I was raised with monotheism. Most of my viewers, I think, were raised with monotheism. So we're going with that, right? We're talking about right and wrong instead of piety. We're talking about God with a capital G instead of God's lowercase g. Anyway, it's the understanding of monotheists that God, capital G, is supposed to be a morally perfect being. That's the sort of thing we get from our scriptures, right? Number three, a morally perfect being would not issue arbitrary commands. I'll briefly say why not, but I also want you to think about it. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I believe that it's true. Why do I believe it's true? Commands create a burden. Commands are meant to be obeyed. They're meant to be followed. In fact, they often come with sanctions. Here's the punishment if you don't follow the command, right? And that is part of our conventional belief about God, that God will punish us for wrongdoing, will punish us for not obeying his commands. That happens in the Garden of Eden, in the Genesis story. That's just the very first time this comes up. So it seems to me, and it seems to a lot of people, that a morally perfect being wouldn't issue commands for no reason. They're burdensome. You have to follow them. You're going to get punished for not following them. You don't want to place a burden on someone for no reason. That itself seems immoral. So a morally perfect being would not issue arbitrary commands. Number 4, therefore, DCT is a false theory. So to recapitulate the whole argument more briefly, if DCT were correct, God's commands regarding morality would be arbitrary, but God is supposed to be morally perfect. A morally perfect being wouldn't make arbitrary commands. My fingers were hidden there. Therefore, DCT is false. Right? If it were true, commands would be arbitrary. God's supposed to be morally perfect. A morally perfect being wouldn't issue arbitrary commands. DCT is false. Okay, and I've got these key questions here. Now, I answered them in my own voice, but you should think about them. Not everybody agrees. Not every philosopher agrees. Why would divine command theory's correctness entail that God's commands are arbitrary? Not everybody, as far as I know, agrees with that, so you think about it. Would a morally perfect being refrain from giving arbitrary commands? Well, I believe so, and I've said why, but you think about it. Well, the third account has definitely failed at this point, right? Euthyphro has insisted that pious is loved by the gods because it is pious. He's insisted that it is not pious because the gods love it. That's not the right direction of causality. That's not the correct metaphysics, right? The correct metaphysics is there's piety, there's something deep there, there's some deep property, and it brings out the love of the gods, right? So that's not compatible with the third account, which seems to say that piety depends on the love of the gods. All right, so we got to move on. How do we do it? How do we move on? Euthyphro's upset and frustrated, right? He feels that he and Socrates have been going in circles. He seems to blame Socrates for that. Socrates throws him a bone. He makes a suggestion that looks fruitful, right? So Socrates is basically suggesting that we could define one virtue in terms of another virtue. Piety and justice are both virtues. What if we connect piety to justice and we try to say how they're related? Would that be a good way to define piety? Well, again, it does look promising at the beginning, right? Maybe this would still be a good way to go, but it doesn't pan out in the text, right? Okay, so Socrates and Euthyphro end up agreeing that all that is pious is of necessity just. They agree on that. So if it's pious, it's just, but then the question is, well, if it's just, then is it pious, right? Do they overlap completely so that piety entails justice, justice entails piety? No. What they end up considering is the view that piety is a part of justice. So if it's pious, it's just, but it's not the case that if it's just, it's pious, right? Because justice ends up being broader and covering a larger area, right? This is in line with our discussion at the beginning that there's a narrow meaning of piety, right, that's confined to our relations with the gods. So, yeah, this could work. Justice could be about how we relate to other beings in general and how we're treating them, and then piety could be a small portion of that. How do we treat divinities? How do we treat gods? Okay, this could work. Let's make sure we understand it. Socrates gives us some analogies. He gives Euthyphro some analogies to make sure Euthyphro is getting it. Um, so Socrates talks about the relationship between fear and shame. So he brings up this poet, and we don't know who the poet is. We don't see this poem elsewhere. We just see a fragment of it in this text. So we can't name the poet. But anyway, what the poet wrote is, "You do not wish to name Zeus, who had done it, and who made all things grow. For where there is fear, there is also shame." So that's the key part of the quotation. Where there is fear, there is also shame. Socrates disagrees with the poet. Okay, he says, well, actually, there is fear without shame. So it's not the case that where there is fear, there is also shame. We fear poverty. We try to avoid it. We take actions to avoid it. So we evidently fear it. We fear sickness, same issue. We take precautions to avoid it. We don't want to get sick, so we fear it. That seems like a fair thing to say. Um, but we don't need to be ashamed. We don't need to be ashamed of poverty and sickness themselves generally. I suppose they could be the result of our own foolish actions, but in general, we don't need to be ashamed if we're poor or sick. Um, and we don't need to be ashamed of our fear of those things. Those are really bad things. I don't mean to say they're very bad. I mean they're genuinely bad. I'm not trying to emphasize, just as a matter of fact, these are objectively bad things that people want to avoid, right? So then we don't need to be ashamed of trying to avoid them. They are things that people generally try to avoid. Okay, so the point is, there is fear without shame. So the poet is wrong. So it is not the case that where there is fear, there is also shame. However, where there is shame, there is fear. Well, why is that? Um, well, if you're ashamed of something, you want to contain it, you want to keep it hidden, or you want to make sure as few people know about it as possible. Uh, it's bad for your reputation. You're ashamed. You don't want it out. You don't want it any more out than it already is. Um, okay, so that makes sense. So where there is shame, there is fear, but it's not the case that where there is fear, there is shame. So fear covers the larger area, right? Um, because there is fear, that doesn't involve shame, but all shame involves fear. Shame is wrapped inside of fear, right? So I've got a picture of a subset here, or a representation of a subset. So in other words, shame is B, represented by B. Fear is represented by A, right? Wherever there's shame, there's fear. Well, that's depicted in the image here. But where there's fear, there is not necessarily shame. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Well, that's also depicted correctly here. There's A without B, and then there's A overlapped by B, right? There's fear without shame, and there's fear overlapped by shame. right? So we get how the language is working, we get how the image is working. So if we say, just to be clear on the language here, if we say that all that is pious is of necessity just, but at the same time we say, but it is not the case that all that is just is pious, but some of it is and some of it isn't, then we're saying that justice is A and piety is B, right? Because we're saying, well, there's justice that doesn't involve piety, right? Just like there's A that doesn't involve B. Um, but then whenever something is pious, it's also just, right? So it makes sense to say piety is represented by B in this image. Okay, so hope that's clear. Basically, we're just saying piety is a part of justice, but I also want you to understand the text, right? And Plato is writing at a time when there's no printing press, and he can't just draw images and have them printed easily. So he's just using words. So it might seem overcomplicated, but he's able to use the words in such a way that it's clear that piety is a strict subset of justice. That would be a different way to put it. The mathematical analogy is also helpful. Um, right, so you might wonder what even numbers are, right? And you could say, well, even numbers, those are a part of number. Okay, that's helpful. But it raises the question, well, which part, right? Well, it's the part divisible by 2, of course. That's the part of number that the even is. So then that tells us where we need to go next. So we can very well say piety is a strict subset of justice, and that's good information. But now we want to know, well, which part? Okay, so that's what we'll handle. That's what we'll try to handle. So we need to know which part of justice is piety. Euthyphro takes the initiative this time, and he says, I think it's the part of the just that is concerned with the care of the gods, while that concerned with the care of men is the remaining part of justice. So that's at 12e. Okay, so care now is involved. Piety is a part of justice. Which part involved with the care of the gods? Well, what exactly does that mean? Socrates is concerned, as he should be. He thinks about how we use the word care, and since he's Socrates, he starts thinking about horse breeding, typical Socratic thing to think about. Well, horse breeding, involves taking care of horses. The horse breeder takes care of horses. Dog trainers care for their dogs. What's involved in that? Well, the horse breeders are supposed to be making the horses better. The dog trainers are supposed to be making the dogs better. That's the kind of care involved. We're doing some training to improve their behavior so that they have a better life in relation to us, at least. I don't know if they have a better horse life or a better dog life, but at least, we're making them better by our standards. Does that work? Right? So piety is the part of justice concerned with the care of gods. Are we doing things to improve the gods' behavior? Is that what we're doing? Well, obviously, once it's pointed out, that looks sacrilegious. So, of course, that's not what Euthyphro wants to say, right? So we're basically at account 4a now, to be clear. That's what it says on the slide. So we moved away from the third account. We began a fourth account by saying piety is a part of justice. I'm going to call this 4a because not only does it say it's the part concerned with the care of the gods, but it construes care in a certain way, and it's obviously not working out. So now Euthyphro will construe care in a different way. Okay, we can see why Euthyphro makes this move. So he's just put us in the wrong relationship to the gods with the way he was construing care, right? We don't want it to be the case that we're analogous to the horse breeder and the gods are analogous to the horse. That doesn't work. So Euthyphro switches it in a sense. He says, "Oh, no, 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 not that kind of care. How about the kind of care that slaves take of their masters?" "Oh," says Socrates, "okay, this is a kind of service that we're talking about then, right? So this is 4b now because we're still saying piety is a part of justice, and we're still saying it's the part concerned with the care of the gods, but now we're construing care in a different way, and so now we're analogous to slaves, and the gods are analogous to masters, right? So that seems better. Okay, so we're like the gods' slaves. We're doing something for them. We're doing some kind of service for them, right? That's what Socrates ends up saying. What do slaves do? They help their masters achieve whatever it is their masters are trying to do. So if a slave's master is a shipbuilder, then the slave is going to help the master build a ship. If the slave's master is a doctor, the slave will help the master achieve health or bring about health, right? So this does seem fine on the face of it. Piety is the part of justice concerned with care of the gods. This now seems to be a kind of service to the gods. We're going to help them achieve something. Well, what? What are we helping the gods achieve? Okay, so the idea that piety is concerned with caring for the gods, somehow that hasn't worked out, right? We've tried to construe care in two different ways, neither worked. It seems to me that Euthyphro and Socrates still agree that piety is a part of justice. They never took that back, and it's certainly compatible with the fifth account, right? So let's take it that that's part of the background here. They're assuming that piety is a part of justice, and that's still working in their conversation, and we're not going to say things that go against that, but things that are in line with the idea that piety is a part of justice, right? It's just that more specific part that it's the part of justice concerned with care for the gods that hasn't worked out, right? We tried to construe care in these different ways, couldn't do it, didn't work out. Okay, so that's over. In a way, Euthyphro just changes the topic. Socrates really tries to press him on this issue of service. Well, what kind of service are we providing for the gods? How can we benefit them? Right? It comes back to benefiting, making them better. Right? It was the same issue we had with the first construal of care. Are we like horse breeders and they're like horses? And so we're improving their behavior. Well, ooh, that doesn't work, right? They're far beyond us, right? So the same thing happens when we try to say, well, they're masters and we're slaves. That sounds better, but, well, what kind of service could we provide? Euthyphro doesn't know, and Socrates doesn't know. Euthyphro doesn't know, and he just starts talking about something else. He says at 14b, piety involves saying and doing what is pleasing to the gods at prayer and sacrifice. So that, that sounds fine. That sounds like stuff that's conventionally pious, but I want to also point out, well, care is a moot point. We're not going to talk about that anymore. Euthyphro has changed the topic. He's changed the direction of the conversation once again. Okay, so how do we work this out? Prayer and sacrifice. As Socrates points out, to pray to the gods is typically to petition them. I'm going to ask for something to happen, or even ask for some specific thing, right? I pray for God's assistance. I mean, that sounds right in general. So to pray is to ask for something. To sacrifice is to give. Here, have this. I'm going to give it up, right? So as Socrates says, oh, well, piety seems to be a sort of trading skill. And Euthyphro says, well, if that's what you want to call it, Socrates, and of course Socrates says, well, Euthyphro, I want to follow you. You've suggested that piety involves asking for things and giving things, and Euthyphro has to agree that that is indeed what I am saying now. Okay, so does that work out? Can we see piety as some kind of trading skill between ourselves and the gods? We have now arrived back at the same problem that we had with 4a and 4b. How do we benefit the gods, right? So imagine it's true that piety is a trading skill. When we pray, we ask for things and we get all kinds of good things. It would be impious to deny it. And we sacrifice things. We give up things for the gods. We give them to the gods. If we think about trade, we're thinking about something that's reciprocal, which indicates there's something wrong. This idea, by the way. But trade benefits both parties, right? It's reciprocal. So we must be giving the gods some really great things then. The good things we get, Greek convention would tell us, come from the gods. So yeah, we're giving them good things. Well, what are these good things we're giving them? Socrates presses Euthyphro on this point. Euthyphro is shying away, of course, from the idea that we can materially benefit the gods. And so what he says now, when really pressed, is, well, the gifts are, among other things, it seems to suggest, context, among other things, honor, reverence, and to please them. These are our gifts to them, right? Socrates sees that Euthyphro is backing off from the idea that we could really benefit the gods, right? So he says, oh, so, our gifts to the gods, these sacrifices that we make, they're not dear and they're not beneficial, but they do please the gods. That's fair of Socrates. I think some people see Socrates as badgering here or leading Euthyphro down a bad path. But there's a genuine problem here, right? Euthyphro has already ruled out, or he should have ruled out, that we could define the pious as what's dear to the gods. He's backing away from the idea that we could benefit the gods. This is the third time, it seems, since 4a and 4b involved this issue of whether we could benefit the gods. So it's right of Socrates, it's appropriate of Socrates to say, now wait a minute, so these gifts, they're not dear and they're apparently not beneficial, but they're pleasing. I mean that's something's wrong there, right? Being pleased seems like a benefit, but can we really benefit the gods? I mean, that's where we've been stumbling already. Um, we like being pleased, so isn't that one of the things that's dear to the gods? So, yeah, Socrates is raising a really important question, and then Euthyphro blows it and says, oh, I think, these gifts that we give are above all dear to the gods. Right? So you know where that gets us. That's the third account. We can't just say that the pious is what the gods love or what's dear to them, because we can't say that their love makes the pious pious, because then piety loses any independence. It seems we've gone in a big circle here, right? And I would say it's Euthyphro's fault. I've read some commentators who blame Socrates here, so I'm going to bring it up again. I believe it's Euthyphro making the backward movement. I'm with Socrates here. So we've had this problem with benefits already, right? 4a and 4b were predicated on the idea that piety is the part of justice that involves caring for the gods somehow. And we tried to construe that care in two different ways. It didn't work out because of this issue of benefits. We can't really benefit the gods, right? And then we get into this fifth account, what I'm calling the fifth account, and we start talking about prayer and sacrifice. Well, to sacrifice does seem to be to give things to the gods, right? I mean, Euthyphro could have resisted that characterization. He could have resisted the idea that piety is a trading skill, but I do believe Socrates was just trying to get clear on what it really is, So he's letting Euthyphro lead him, but he does have to sort of parrot back to Euthyphro some of the things that Euthyphro says to get clarity, right? We all do that. It's called active listening. You're supposed to repeat things back to people. So Socrates does that. He engages in active listening, right? And so we get to this crucial point where Socrates wants to know, in light of the failure of 4a and 4b, what are we giving the gods that is beneficial to them so that we don't get all the advantage in our trades with them? And that's when Euthyphro says, oh, honor, reverence, and to please them. Oh, to please them. That's a gift. Okay. But, you know, we've already ruled out that the pious is what is dear, and we've already ruled out, it seems, it wasn't as explicit, but we seem to have ruled out that the pious is beneficial to the gods. So the pious is pleasing, or these gifts that we sacrifice to them, they're pleasing but not beneficial or dear. Oh, well, Socrates, these gifts that we give to the gods are very dear to them. They please them and they're dear to them. Well, sure. I mean, we like things that please us. So that makes sense if you're myopic, right? And you're very narrowly focused on something and you aren't paying attention to what you've already rejected. So anyway, Euthyphro's fault. They've gone in a circle. Um, the circle suggests some conceptual confusion on Euthyphro's part. That's why I was harping on whose fault it was. The circle suggests that Euthyphro is confused about something, and so naturally he ends up going back to the point of confusion, right? He can't clear it up, so then he can't move past it. The confusion remains, right? And if I had to venture a guess here, I would say the confusion is to think that piety could do anything for the gods. Piety is for our sake. Pious actions are for our sake. So leave their love out of it, you know, leave any benefit to them out of it, leave their being pleased out of it. Our relationship with the gods is not reciprocal. They give us good things. We can't really give them anything. It's not a reciprocal relationship at all. They just give us good things. Piety is something for us. It's not for them. Okay, so I don't know how to work that out completely, but I believe that's Socrates' view. It just doesn't give us a definition of piety, so I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there's a conceptual confusion here making us go in a circle. If I had to pick a specific confusion, it would be that piety could do anything at all for the gods. We should probably focus on benefits to ourselves and assume that, the gods just give us all these good things and they expect nothing in return because there's nothing we could conceivably do for them in return. So we have to look at it that way. And even in the third account, we weren't looking at it that way because we thought we could do things that the gods would love. Um, but no, right? We can just do things that are pious for our own benefit and our own sake. That's how it seems to me. Okay, how do you work the gods into the definition then? Uh, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. It's not answered in the text, but I believe Socrates was thinking along those lines. Okay, here we are at the end of our conceptual adventure, we could call it. I like the way this dialogue ends. It might seem like an easy ending to some, or a slapdash sort of ending. I think it's a very appropriate ending. We've got Euthyphro saying, Socrates, I'm out of time. I've got to go. And then we've got Socrates saying, oh, this is so disappointing, Euthyphro. I really thought, I was going to learn about piety and I was going to be better forever afterward. That's what he says, right? So we've got this contrast between someone who doesn't take the time to achieve depth in moral knowledge. We're contrasting that with someone who is willing to do what it takes, right? And then, of course, as so many of his other statements, this final statement of Socrates is full of irony, right? There's a surface truth here. Socrates is disappointed. If Euthyphro could tell him what piety is, he would be very happy about that, right? So there is a sort of disappointment on that, but then on the other hand, you know, the disappointment can't really be that Euthyphro is leaving. Euthyphro has been useless, right? So there's some kind of disappointment, and it's got to do with Socrates being unable to say what piety really is, right? And here's a guy that seemed really confident about piety. So certainly it's too bad. It's unfortunate Euthyphro didn't hold up to questioning better, right? Okay, so this dialogue is important. It continues to be important for holding up these robust criteria regarding knowledge. Right? Hey, tell me what all pious actions have in common. Tell me what makes them pious. Give me a model. It's not clear to what extent these conditions can be satisfied in any given case when you look at any virtue. But we understand the motivation behind the conditions. It's helpful that they've been stated here. There is, of course, a lot in this dialogue about the relationship between religion and ethics. To what extent can ethics be grounded in religious belief? Well, there are deep problems there, as we've seen, right? And then another issue that should stick with us is the limits of conventional morality. On the one hand, Socrates himself lives by convention to some extent. I've said this in connection with the Crito, right? He takes this dream very seriously and thinks it's a communication from the gods, right? So to some extent, we have no choice but to live according to moral convention, but we want more and we quest for more. Socrates is trying to get more than that. We're rational beings, right? The unexamined life is not worth living for us. So we want our questions about morality answered, right? And Euthyphro seems to be getting it wrong. He's prosecuting his own father, right? Conventionally, this is bad, so we have to go beyond convention to defend it. We do need rational inquiry here. Euthyphro is not up to the task, right? So there's a sort of lesson here about what it really takes to go against moral convention. You'd better have some insight. You'd better have some wisdom. It seems like Socrates does, right? And he does threaten civil disobedience in the Apology. So that's against convention, but there's real insight there backing it up. And then again, we get a good contrast. Euthyphro is going against convention, but there doesn't seem to be any insight there. All right. Well, we'll leave it at that. I too must go. I'm not in a hurry, but the lecture has to end sometime. Thanks for watching.